Okay, thank you. Good evening and welcome to the final meeting of the Genuinely Affordable Homes Scrutiny Panel. Yes, this is a hybrid meeting. I think there's 5 of us in the chamber and another 3, I believe, on virtually. So far, I don't think so much for that. Right, I will run through the apologies for absence, etc. We've got 2 cabinet members who were going to come to speak to us. Councillor Donnelly and Councillor Munro have given their apologies, and we have a substitution, I believe. Is he online? No. Okay. We're hoping to have Dan Wilson-Craw from Generation Rent, who would replace Alicia Kennedy, who was our co-optee, but he may be joining us online. Okay, so we're going to move on quite quickly because we've got quite a packed agenda to get through tonight, and obviously we want to have enough time for recommendations at the end of the meeting. There are no, item 2, no urgent matters, I believe, unless somebody draws them to my attention. Item 3, matters to be considered in private. Again, I don't believe there are any. Any declarations of interest anyone wants to make? No, that's, so we go on to the minutes from the previous meeting on 24th of January. Does anybody got any points they want to make, or think they've been wrongly quoted? Or okay, in that case, are they agreed? Okay, I will sign those shortly. And we are racing on to item 6, which is to do with Broadway Living and the Broadway Living Development Guide. I'm going to hand straight over to Gordon Cooper, who is in the chamber. If you can introduce yourself. And before I get to that, if people sort of make notes of any questions they want to ask, but please only ask questions about the actual presentation itself, because we have got quite a tight meeting, so don't ask questions sort of outside the ambit of the presentation.
Okay. Good evening. My name's Gordon Cooper. I'm a Principal Project Manager with Broadway Living. I've been asked to give you a quick overview of the Broadway Living Development Guide. That's it. In a sentence, the guide is a brief for all project team members, setting out standards for each Broadway Living development. Just by way of a bit of background information, it's a cross-department collaboration within the council. About 60 individuals contributed from various departments such as regeneration, planning, asset management, operations. The Broadway Living board members were also involved, bringing in expert industry insight. As it happens, Tony Clements was Strategic Director of Place when we started the guide, and he was in effect the project sponsor. He sat on steering groups and was instrumental in its direction and content. We were supported through the documentation by PTE architects, award-winning architects with a particular strength in sustainability, research and innovation. There's a strong emphasis in the guide on homes supporting a healthy lifestyle, and another key member of the steering group was a doctor working within the NHS for Ealing. It's a live document. It responds to changing events, housing industry trends and legislation. It'll be continually updated from feedback from live projects, external forces and resident feedback. It sits alongside and is compatible with a number of other documentation. It's aligned to Ealing's targets of creating good quality jobs, tackling climate crisis and fighting inequality. It's aligned to external documents such as GLA standards, building regs, fire safety, and it sits alongside internal documents such as specifications, employers' requirements, and residents' manuals. And lastly, it sets aspirational standards. We accept not every project will be able to comply with every aspect. The guide's got 3 core objectives: sustainability, healthy homes, and affordable homes. And there's a 22-point checklist which sort of sums everything up. And this is used as a key document at key gateways through projects. We don't have time tonight to go through all 22 points, all 60 pages, so I thought it'd be useful just to drop in on a couple of aspects, that of healthy homes and that of strong communities and social interaction. The next few slides are just a few photos illustrating various aspects of that. What do we mean by healthy homes? This really covers internal living spaces, healthy outdoor spaces, ecology and biodiversity, and space standards. One of the key issues of the guide is that we build all future homes to Passive House standard. For those that aren't familiar, this is a low energy design, maximising passive solar gain, has high levels of insulation, it's a very airtight building, and typically it would have high performance triple glazed windows. It gives improved thermal comfort, it's good indoor air quality, low heating requirement, and crucially low energy bills. We also talk in the document about healthy internal living spaces. We talk about good quality daylight and sunlight in homes. Window design, positioning and orientation are all crucial. We want minimal noise transmission from outside. Some of our sites are in fairly hostile locations, busy roads, backing onto railways, or in the Heathrow flight path. So we want to minimise the impact of external noise and polluting environment. We want to minimise noise transmission between dwellings as well. And we also want to include natural materials where practical. We're talking things like natural, eco-friendly, water-based paints, exposed brickwork, slate in common entrance halls, timber. Where practical, we want to reduce toxic and polluting man-made materials. We want healthy outdoor spaces as well. External spaces need to be designed to be healthy, inclusive, and available to all the community. We want a range of formal and informal places to encourage social integration on our developments. We want healthy streets as well. All developments should be designed to healthy street principles. Where possible, we're looking to have car-free streets or car-free areas within developments. And we want schemes to promote active transport. Development should improve the biodiversity and ecology of the neighbourhood. We talk about living walls, ponds, planting native plants and trees. We want to encourage wildlife, bats, birds, hedgehogs, and all sorts of insects. We touch on space standards as well. Generally, we're aligned to the space standards set out in GLA documentation, but the 2 areas where we want to go above there are internal storage. We ask for 50% above minimum. And I think one of the photos illustrates what we want to do externally. I think we've all seen balconies that tend to get full of all sorts of clutter that don't fit in the house. We acknowledge that and want balconies to be designed to be a bit larger and have some screening so you can actually put your washing outside rather than dry it inside the flats and use tumble dryers and things like that. Moving on to stronger communities and social interaction. We want to build in places to rest and interact inside and outside the homes. We want to perhaps celebrate the design of communal entrances to encourage social interaction between residents. Talk about things like double height spaces, naturally lit spaces. I think this bottom photo illustrates the sort of thing: natural materials, a sheltered space with a window, and crucially, a little seat just next to the entrance so you can sit down, have a chat to residents, wait for the Amazon parcel, that sort of thing. Or it might be deck access like the top photo, and it's just creating little spaces where you can put a few chairs where some residents can meet together and interact, not inside flats. We want connection with the street. Main frontages need to connect directly with the street. Buildings need to enliven and enhance the public realm. Dustbins, meter cupboards, and boundary treatments are all crucial. We want to design safe and secure spaces. Residents must feel comfortable and safe in their homes and surroundings. External spaces should be overlooked and well lit at night, but without creating light pollution. Where possible, we want to design with the residents. We want to empower and instill a sense of ownership and control amongst residents. It's not always possible in every scheme, but it's possible more on regeneration schemes. And we want to work with resident panels to critique other designs. We also specifically measure post-occupancy feedback. After 9 months of occupancy, we'll do feedback questionnaires and gauge resident satisfaction and feed that back into the design. We also want to design in future flexibility. Design should enable residents to stay in their homes as their needs change or the family makeup changes. And we want to have alternative layouts of homes to show how it can be adapted for future use, how homework can take place inside the homes. That's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the guide. Just to conclude, we're deliberately setting the bar high with this guide. We owe it to residents of Ealing to deliver high quality, sustainable, inclusive, healthy, affordable homes for a diverse mix of residents. We want to set an aspirational standard for affordable housing for other boroughs to follow and set a standard that residents and councillors alike can be proud of in years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I've got a question on my own, but anybody else here or online want to ask any questions about the presentation? I can't see any. I'm struggling to see hands up on online. But, Councillor. Right, Councillor Hashani, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much, Councillor Summers. Thank you for that presentation. Really great to see. I mean, it is really, I think, forward-thinking and ambitious, which is fantastic. I didn't see anything around them, and maybe I've missed something, but around like height of the developments. Perhaps it doesn't fall into this guide, but does that feature at all around, you know, how high the buildings should be, and you know, the size of the buildings?
Do you want me to answer that? Yes, I've had to edit a bit out because I was given 10 minutes to talk. There is a bit of a guidance on heights of buildings. We don't particularly specify heights or things like that, but we do raise some of the concerns and issues around tall buildings. And so there is detail in the guide there, but unfortunately, you know, I had to edit the presentation a bit, so I didn't cover that tonight.
Yeah, are you happy with that, Councillor Hashani?
I am happy with that. So I think when this is available, I'd like to read through it, but very happy with that. Thank you.
Okay, if you're able to forward us any.
The full document is available now, so
okay, right,
I'm not sure how we do it, but we can circulate that to people afterwards.
Okay, we'll get that information to you, Councillor. Councillor Kingston.
Just in one of the slides, just sort of pictures some builders, and they literally seem to be slotting a very large panel into place. I've just had queries about the durability and strength of something like that.
So I missed the first bit, the durability and strength of.
In one of the panels, in one of the pictures, there's a picture sort of builders putting a very large panel with sort of doors, window spaces. I just want to know how durable these were.
Oh, right. I think that was just to include that into to say, you know, we are considering off-site manufacture, steel frames, timber frames, things like that. But at the same time, we're not prescriptive. Things like passive house, you can achieve that through off-site manufacture, or you can achieve it through traditional methods. So I think on current schemes, we're using mix of both. Generally, panels like that would, I remember the photo you were talking about, that would tend to be only for something that's 3-story or less. It wouldn't be for larger schemes that would perhaps have a concrete frame or something.
I just wonder if I could ask a couple of questions. Firstly, you said this was put together in 2021, I think, originally, or it was.
I think that's when the first draft edition was done. That's when the first schemes were coming through. So that's the date on.
Okay, so that was sort of post-lockdown. So we've sort of built into it sort of lessons learned about, you know, if people have to spend a lot of time at home, or nowadays, you know, home working, etc., home offices, that's sort of built into it.
It is, and I think critically also, it made us focus on the quality of outdoor space. I think we all got to like that, and that's kind of why the balcony thing came in, that having balconies just that much bigger, it was crucial. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we I think we saw at Copley Close some of these flats with balconies, and there was well, I'm not sure if they were as big as the new standard you're bringing in, but they certainly would be beneficial for people. The other thing was about passive house. I remember going to one of the Broadway, I think it was one of Broadway Living's first ever, one of the council's first ever sort of in-house developments in Northolt on Eastcote Lane near the Northolt Leisure Centre, and it was on the sort of 3rd or 4th floor. It had really nice views, really big windows, but I'm aware that, you know, passive house, you know, had much smaller windows, you know, and triple glazed obviously, but I'm just sort of worried. You also mentioned, you know, you're aware of daylight issues, but how do you balance that when you're trying to sort of maximize energy conservation, you know, energy conservancy, but you know, get maximum light within a flat?
That's a good question. The passive house doesn't necessarily have smaller windows. It tends to have smaller windows on north-facing, northeast and northwest elevations. On the south elevations, they might be smaller, they might not be smaller, it depends. If they are larger windows to get in light, we'd need to incorporate measures to ensure there isn't solar overheating and things like that. So there might be shades and things like that, or it might be designed. So it would be a balance with getting the quality of daylight in the house. So it needn't necessarily be smaller, it just really be on the north elevation, which again, that's why if the scheme is designed from the outset as passive house, it will tend to be the bathrooms and the kitchens or things that don't necessarily need big windows that are on the north elevations, and the ones with the bigger windows would be the principal reception rooms or bedrooms.
I can't see any more questions, so we will leave it at that. Thank you very much for being for your brevity and your conciseness. Any of the officers, you know, you're free once you've done your presentations to leave the meeting. So thank you very much, Gordon.
Okay.
And we'll move on to the next item, which is item 7, building safety, which Stephen Rizzo is going to present on. Pronounce your name correctly.
Stephen was perfectly correct. The surname's Rizzo, but it's close enough. I'll respond to everything. Good evening. I'm Stephen Rizzo. I'm the Assistant Director for Building Control. I'm here to present the report. I don't have slides. It's the report that is in the pack. And I just want to give an overview as we go through it and what I've covered in it. In section 1 of the report, I've included an overview of the drivers for the new legislation and have explained that we're in a transitional period between the old way of designing and procuring homes and the government's envisaged new approach. This is via the introduction of new building safety legislation and a new building safety regulator within the Health and Safety Executive. The second section of the report provides information about the role of the building safety regulator. The press and mass media have mostly been interested in the impact of the new regulator on higher rise residential buildings, but the regulator's remit is further reaching than the headlines would have us believe. The regulator will have a role to play in overseeing all building work, and this new regulator will also have a remit to hold local authorities to account to the new higher standards of safety in all of our roles as a landlord, as a developer, and as a regulatory body. I've endeavoured to give an overview of the Council's responsibilities in section 3 of the report. It should be noted that the changes are far-reaching, and we're advised that the legislation will have a major impact on the way the Council operates, procures and delivers its buildings. In section 4 of the report, I outline that the Council is in a robust position to accommodate these changes, and that our processes are continuously developing in tandem with the legislation as it is being published. We are in a transitional period. We do not yet know the detail of all the secondary legislation, and we'll have to remain a flexible and learning organisation during this transition period. The outcome of the new legislation, we are told, is that it will make our residents safe and that they will feel safe in their homes. And this is via a more regulated construction industry. It is likely that the timeline for delivery of genuinely affordable homes between commencing the design and occupation will be longer than it's currently expected, and that homes built for the market sale will be similarly affected. There may be additional costs associated with that, but as we become better at dealing with the new regulations, we'll become more efficient in how we tackle that. And the report was for information so that you are aware of the effect it may have on the programmes. And we'll continue to develop and work with the regulator and with the legislators on how we implement this to ensure that the properties are safe and our residents feel safe. That's the report.
Again, I've got a load of questions, but I'm going to open out to the floor first. Councillor Mohammed.
Thank you, Chair. My question is on section 4. You mentioned that the council has a robust measure in dealing with the new changes in legislation. I noticed on your point 4.5, it's kind of alluding to new build, but can you elaborate your existing stock, how the robust measures applies to? Thank you.
Could I ask for clarity on, do you mean with our existing stock or across the whole of the construction industry?
No, the council existing stock. Thank you.
So the council has changed its operating procedures. So throughout the departments that are affected, we've put in place ways of looking at existing buildings and new, and comparing that with the requirements of the new legislation. And in some cases, this has meant entire new departments or entire new sections within departments being created. And in the case of the department I work in the environment and sustainability, with the building regulation surveyors being involved in all building work and making sure that all the building work that's been done on our residences and our properties will meet the requirements of the new standards.
Can I just ask a supplementary on that? That's a good point. But from a legal point of view, presumably any building that's currently been built under the, when it was given planning permission, etc., the new building Safety Act, it can't apply retrospectively, so declare an existing building unsafe, or do they have to be sort of retrofitted, or is it just only applies to new building?
That's a very good question. So existing buildings that fall within the higher risk, the taller residential buildings, they have to be registered with the regulator, and the regulator will inspect them at regular intervals. It's currently thought to be 5-yearly intervals. The council's building managers will have all of the information prepared for the regulator. It's part of the operating procedures that we're running with, and we'll have a full safety case written for those taller buildings.
So, presumably there is a current situation where the health and safety executive or somebody could declare a building unsafe. So it doesn't sort of make any difference to that, or?
That's correct. There's no change to what makes a building unsafe. Where you have a dangerous building, when it is collapsing, it is dangerous whether or not the new regulations apply. What the regulator will do if he finds a building, public or private sector, that is a taller building where he believes there are measures that need to be taken place or added in, he will raise those with the principal accountable person, and they would be expected to ensure that everything is rectified. It's not a complex process. With the inspector coming along, they will see what needs to be done. They'll examine the safety case, and they will more than likely give the building a clean bill of health, providing everything is operating well. They won't look at a building built in 1960, say, and say it's automatically unsafe. There would have to be reasons. And a building that was built would already have been assessed by the council's staff, and maybe with the use of specialists to give the reasons why it isn't dangerous. And it's part of the legislation to ensure that the residents feel safe, not just are safe. It's that whole remit to give buildings a safer message following the tragedy in 2017.
Mohammed, I'm going to let you come back on that.
Just for clarification, this new legislation, Building Safety Act, it's not just for new build, it's also existing buildings, and it's not only covering buildings that are high risk or high rise, like 18 meter and high, but it's covering other buildings that might be unsafe. Is that correct assumption?
It covers all buildings and all building work, and the existing legislation also covers all buildings and all building work. That's correct.
Because obviously, infamously in the case of Grenfell, that was an existing building which was refurbished to disastrous effect, but presumably the new regulator would have a very different way of working.
Sorry, so it's Darren Hennigan. I'm the Strategic Director for Housing and Environment. I thought I'd just be a little bit follow up on the existing housing stock, because members will be aware. I came to overview and scrutiny, what was it, Councillor Summers, probably 10 months ago, 11 months now, because we were having issues in that area, indeed, we've been working with the regulator of social housing, who did indeed serve a notice on this in around that May time. So we've been working through a whole series of actions in order to bring ourselves up to the existing speeches legislation, which are all around things like making sure that we know what we've got, we know where it is, and we make sure we tested it. And if we tested it and there's something wrong, we then go and fix it. So things like gas, electricity, Legionella, lifts, and the one I've completely missed, which is fire safety as well. It's called flagel, so I try and remember them. What Stephen's talking about is, and there is existing legislation that makes you do all of that stuff. There's also the Building Safety Act, which we already have, which means that if you have a dangerous structure, i.e. it's about to fall down, then Stephen, in his capacity as a building safety officer, or a building control officer, can go and close it down and make sure it's structurally safe. And so when we have an issue, maybe we've had a fire in a block, a smaller block, or whatever else, we will then ask Stephen's team to go and make sure it's safe before we let residents go back in again. This new legislation is a response to Grenfell, and exactly as you say, Councillor Summers, what happened there is that council, probably well-meaning, decided that what they were going to do is retrofit a building to improve insulation and to support those residents in order that they have lower fuel bills and all that sort of stuff. At that point, you didn't need to redo your building safety case. You're able to do that work, and as long as it complied with British standards or European standards at that time, it was all okay. What we have to do now is we have to fundamentally understand how existing council houses, particularly the taller ones, work both in a normal state and if there's an emergency. So how do we communicate with residents? How do we respond to their concerns, but also how do we evacuate them, etc., if there's a problem? If this legislation was in place when Grenfell was being refurbished, there would have been a much more thorough assessment, and somebody like Stephen, or indeed the Health and Safety Exec, would have far more information in order to be able to their enforcement decisions. And if they felt what was happening was unsafe, they wouldn't have allowed it to happen in the first instance. So this is a very progressive piece of legislation that helps the regulator understand what's going on and take the appropriate action. So although there were lots of things on the statute that allowed people like the Health and Safety Set to do things, they had got nothing to base it on because you hadn't got to share that information with them. Most importantly, you didn't have to share the information with tenants. And that was what the other thing that the inquiry said, is that tenants were completely left in the dark about this, and that's the other thing that's happening. So at the moment, I'm registering all of our higher buildings. If you live in a council block, you'll see there'll be lots of boards going up telling you how to get information about it. We're setting up committees, building safety committees for each one of the blocks, so residents can know what's going on and understand how we are keeping them safe, and put their hand up and go, because that was the other thing from Grenfell, they were saying this isn't safe, someone needs to do something about it. They can put their hand up and we are duty bound to respond. So that this is a very important thing. There's a lot of work going on in order to be able to make this happen. I'm very happy at the end, Councillor Summers, to be able to take any further questions on building safety, because it is a really, really important thing. We've been going through the regulator, although I don't want to be complacent, but we are getting towards the end of the process with the regulator of social housing, and we're pretty confident that in the next couple of months the notice will be withdrawn, because we have done everything we said we were going to do. And now all the gas is tested, all the electrics are tested, all the buildings are tested, and all that, and we're in a much better place. But we're actually going through the different audits, and indeed Nick, who's going to speak left, is from a consultancy called ARC, who've been like our critical friends throughout the process, and they're doing a report to make sure this doesn't ever happen again.
Yeah, stay there, because we have more questions. I've got a couple more questions. I know Councillor Cordier, but Councillor Hashani had a hand up. Have you got a cold, Councillor?
Sorry, was that for Councillor Hashani? Me?
Yes, you're
Oh,
on there.
hi.
But,
Yes.
I detected you were struggling with a cold.
I do. I've been going through flu and cold for the last week and a half, so that's why I'm not there today. I wanted to ask about resources and capacity in terms of in-house in the council with the officers and things like that. How do you feel that's going? Do you think you have enough support to carry out this work, which feels like it will be a significant amount of work, which is very, very important, and of course we all endorse it, and do you just have that right sort of resource and support to make sure that this work is as thorough as possible, and we are making sure that we are adjusting where necessary any buildings to ensure safety?
Yeah, I'll let Stephen and maybe Darren come back on that.
So as far as support from the regulator goes, it's been interesting in that they haven't fully developed their own procedures yet. The operations of the council from a regulatory point of view is that we're looking at this and working it through in order to get everything set up. The actual regulations aren't fully developed for the council's responsibilities as regulators, but we're working that through, and we'll come back to members if there is a need for further resources. We don't at this moment envisage there will be, but the operating standards rules have only recently been published, and we're trying to work our way through those to see what impact there will be.
Okay, so just in terms of the resource in order to be able to do the work that we need to support residents living in our council homes, I think I spoke to members a little while ago about the housing HRA business plan, the housing revenue account, and the business plan, and the challenges that we had within that, but also the prioritisation that we were doing around building safety. So our priorities are building safety, actually managing the estate and making sure that we can relet properties and doing them up on relet, and then zero carbon retrofit. We then, if we've got any money left over, do kitchens and bathrooms and windows and all those sorts of things. But absolutely number one priority, both this last year and this current year and next year, will be building safety. We've invested, members have invested £1.8 million in a brand new housing building safety team. And also this last year, we spent around £9.5 million on the work we needed to do to catch up with all the work that we hadn't been doing for years, and make sure our tenants are safe. This year, I think we've got £6 million in the capital programme. But if we need to put more money into it, we will do, because we consider as members, and certainly believe members have always said this to me, this is the number one priority. So yeah, money isn't the issue. Getting the skills, because every other council is wanting to do the same thing. We're all on the same journey together. Getting skills and trained people is an issue. We've had a big recruitment program. We went from a team of 3 permanent staff to 36 in order to be able to do this work. And within that, there's a lot of training development we're going to have to do for those staff. We're very lucky. We managed to poach the head of building safety from Peabody, which was good. And also we've got some incredibly experienced people coming from London Fire Brigade, but we still need to train them up in order to be able to understand Ealing. So there is, alongside the recruitment program, there is also a great big program of development of those staff to make sure that they can really liaise well with residents and listen to residents, as well as being a technical expert. It's okay being technical, but you've got to be able to have your ears working as well. And that's one of the things I'm training my staff to do.
On that point, I think it was a Home Affairs Select Committee I was watching recently, and they were saying there is a dearth of people in the country with sort of fire safety and building control skills. Is it? I mean, I was thinking, as far as apprenticeships and things like that. Are you able to take people sort of straight off A levels, or do they have to have a relevant degree in a certain subject?
We do have apprentices. We bring them in at all levels. If they don't have a degree, we put them through one. If they have the wrong degree, we put them through the right one, a transition. And we need to bring on the next generation. It's a 7-year training cycle, so it takes a long time to train somebody from scratch to being a competent regulator in the fire safety and building safety field.
This is something which I think is a real opportunity out of these challenges. There's an opportunity, because I think this is one of the jobs in a council that certainly I growing up didn't really know about. You've got to be a building safety officer for the council. It's like, well, what the hell's that? So we are working with colleagues in children's services to go out and to talk to young people and say, listen, some really, really good, these are good, well-paid jobs, and there is some really good, meaningful work within the council, good money, and you get to do a really, really important job. And to say it to, alongside Stephen, he's got some apprentices in there. We've got 7 in our team as well, which is bringing people in from A level, and indeed a little bit further on, because some of them are maybe surveyors that need to translate their skills into building safety. This is a real opportunity for that and to shape the service with them. There's a lot of good, talented people out there. But just sometimes when when you're doing your careers stuff, you don't always necessarily understand all the jobs that are within councils. And that's part of our challenge, is to say, no, these are good jobs. Come and work for the council. It's reasonably well paid, and you get good job satisfaction out of it. So there is a real opportunity there.
Thank you. Councillor Corday, you've been very patient. Over to you.
I think partly my questions answered already been given. Again, I would raise the point under a new regulator. When we are talking about the safety and standards of all buildings, existing buildings and the new buildings, are we talking also about the privately rented homes or rented accommodations? Are they coming under the new legislation? And secondly, any idea when this new legislation is coming into force? Do we have any idea?
The legislation comes into effect on the 1st of October, so of this year. So we have a transitional period between October and March, and that will inform that will give everyone a chance to get everything sorted. Part of the legislation is already in effect, which is why we've already registered or already registering our taller buildings with the regulator. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the first part of your question. Oh, the private sector. So whether with specific reference to taller buildings, it doesn't matter whether it's privately owned or publicly owned, they all come under the same regulator and they all must have the same standards. With the lower rise buildings, the building regulations which come under the regulator will still be overseen by the building safety regulator. But the building regulations may be inspected by the local authority or by a private sector building inspector as currently exists.
And sorry, Chair, just to add to that as well, remember that members decided to introduce a licensing scheme for private sector landlords across the borough. And that is helping us find all of those private rented properties and taking the interventions that we need to, which isn't always about building safety. Some of it is, the house isn't collapsing, but it's damp, or, frankly, the tenants are being exploited, and we're able to intervene in that space. And that's just because of the decision, I think a very courageous decision that members took in order to be able to deliver that scheme. Which is, I think I'd be very happy, Chair, at another panel to come back and discuss the private rented sector scheme. I know this scrutiny panel is finishing after this, but a future thing, I'm very happy to come and talk to members about the success of that area.
So you want to come back on that?
I think we are all aware in Southall, there are still bed and sheds. They are privately rented out. We still are not really using our enforcement team. I don't know how can we really actively to act upon on such legislation. So I think we need to look into it seriously. Thank you.
Absolutely, Councillor. And of course, our planning enforcement team are very active in that space, but it's a big problem. And there's been a lot of developments out of sight. And indeed, we use things like Google Maps, etc., to be able to see above property, to see what's in the back garden, because sometimes there's a terrace in the way. And yet in Southall, but also in other areas of the borough as well, there's been all unlicensed or unlawful development. And our planning enforcement team are not afraid to take strong action, but there's a lot of it, and we're working our way through it.
I've got a different question about item 2.2 about the golden thread of building information. So basically, each building has to have this sort of book, sort of explaining its history. What was done when, presumably when it was rewired, etc., etc. Again, is that for existing buildings as well as new buildings? And also, how will it be stored? Is it sort of like a file, or is it a computer, you know, is it on a USB stick? And how easy it is for, you know, a contractor or whatever to search it, or a regulator or the council themselves. I mean, I'm just trying to get my head around how it works.
So if you were building a new building, you know what components go into it. And all of those components would be, during that construction period, it's an information-rich period, and you can capture everything about each component. That would normally be stored electronically on the plans and the specifications. And that would be held by the owner of that building after the building was complete. So that if a component went wrong, they would know what the component was and what risk it was, and how they could replace it, and how many of those components there were. If, say, there was a fault found with a particular heating mechanism, and it was in hundreds of buildings across the country, there'd be a product recall. And because they know which buildings it's in, they would then be able to the regulator could write to these building owners and say, we need all these products to be withdrawn and replaced. So it will be an electronic database. It will be held by the owner of the building, and the owner of the building will appoint what they call an accountable person, or a principal accountable person, who will have the control and the funding to rectify and manage that building properly. Whenever that building is then altered, exactly the same rules apply, and you will then have to ensure that you update your database of product information. The same is equally true for existing buildings, but we don't have as good a insight into how the older buildings were built. So there'll be areas of grey, and what the regulator is expecting is that those grey areas, there is a margin of error, so that there'll be a better provision of safety, or at least a sufficient margin of safety for where you don't know that what it actually is in the building. But I think a majority of our buildings have been surveyed, and we should have a pretty good handle on how they are built and how they perform normally and in the event of an emergency.
And Councillor Summers, that information is kept electronically, but it's also part of the requirement is that we put it into the public domain, so that tenants can see that information about their building. And indeed, that's part of the, well, hold on a minute, well, why is it like that? And is that safe questions that we're going to be able to have to answer? There are a number of different things with existing blocks that we have to do, and we are a good way through them all. So we have to update emergency lighting and update all the sprinkler systems, all those sorts of things. We spent a huge amount of money in this last year on new fire doors and compartmentalisation. And all that comes into the building safety case for that building, so that the tenants and the leaseholders predominantly that live there understand how the building works, so that they can then react to it. Far more than what you get in a hotel where you get the evacuation plan. There's much more detailed information. It's not the same as it is for a brand new build, but we do know our buildings pretty well now. Fortunately in Ealing, we haven't over the years tried to do too many complex and difficult things to them. So we don't have a lot of external cladding to contend with. We tend to have fairly traditional brick built taller buildings, and those are much easier to design. We do have issues, and there will be some things which we will have to acknowledge are an issue, which, as Stephen says, a grey area, and we will then deal with in time. So, for example, we want to remove all the waste chutes from our higher buildings because they can create a fire tunnel. And we won't have completed all that by October, but we will know about it, and we will have measures to control it, and we'll have a plan to deal with it into the future. And I think if any members have been in areas like Norfolk, we'd be consulting local residents about moving those bin compounds out, closing off the chutes and moving the bins outside of the block, because that's a much safer way of doing it. So, the building safety cases are a public document, and people will be able to see what's going on with their building, and they will be able to comment on it and ask us questions, and we'll have to be able to explain to them how things work.
I don't want to go on, but you could just clarify how a tenant would find, search their own building's fire?
By October, it will be through the council's website, and you'll be able to see where you live, and you will be able to see the building safety case for it and all the documentation that's appropriate to it to back up the assessments that have been made. We're anticipating quite a few questions, hopefully.
So how you will be able to see it where?
On the council's website. This will be publicly available information. It won't just be for the people in that particular block, because it can be for anybody, but particularly it's aimed at the people that live within that block so they can understand it. There's also information boards within the blocks telling people the information, and there'll be, you know, files and whatever else, paper versions, because not everybody wants to use the internet, and your local area housing office will also, the housing hubs will have information too, but the main thing will be through the council's website.
Okay, thanks very much. Any other questions on that presentation? I don't think so. Thank you very much. We'll move on to item 8, which is housing services, the external operating environment. Over to you, Nick Sedgwick.
Thank you very much. Yeah, my name's Nick Sedgwick. I am a consultant with ARC Consultancy, and we have, we've been supporting the council for about the last year, initially around building safety issues and work with the regulator, but also supporting a range of the other improvement plans that have been delivered in the housing service. I was asked to provide a summary of the sort of operating environment now and in the next next couple of years, really, for the management of the council's housing stock. I'm going to primarily talk around the government policy and changing regulation that's going to apply. But I did just want to start by talking through it, because the agenda really is being driven by quite a few high-profile news stories. And you know, obviously that affects the way we operate. So you probably will have seen that series of stories on ITV News around poor quality social housing. Quite a lot of that in London, but in other areas, both councils and housing associations. There was obviously the Grenfell tragedy and the inquiry and all the learning that's been taken from that, and that has really driven a lot of government policy, which I'll come on to. The regulator is very much getting into this space as well. So I could have chosen from a wide range of headlines from councils and housing associations that have had regulatory judgments against them and have received notices. Many of those in London, actually, but there have been another 2 or 3 just in the last week where the regulator is taking action against councils around building safety. There was the tragic case of the child in Rochdale who died after living in a damp house with mould, and there's been an awful lot of follow-up to that as well, and you're aware of the actions that all landlords have had to take as a result of that. There is an awful lot of action by the minister, but also by the housing ombudsman to sort of name and shame landlords as well. And one final one is that, you know, on top of all of that, landlords are having to deal with the affordability for residents as well. And at the same time, the government puts a cap on the rent increase that you can apply below inflation. Still a large increase for residents and the impact on affordability, but also putting a limit on what you can spend on maintaining your homes. So there's, all of that is coming together at the same time. In terms of government policy, a lot of that is still driven from the social housing white paper that was published back in November 2020. And this was this emerged following quite a lot of engagement by government ministers, etc., with residents of social housing, but was clearly driven especially by the Grenfell tragedy. And it set the agenda really in terms of changing the approach to regulating the consumer standards, so the services provided by landlords. And I'll come on and explain that in a minute. Also looking for much greater transparency, so residents understand the way services are provided and so they can challenge them, and giving residents a voice. A lot in there around building safety, which you've already discussed, but some other issues that maybe have dropped down the agenda, partly because of that, all those press stories. So the Social Housing White Paper did talk about things like tackling domestic abuse, tackling loneliness, supporting residents' health, because they were the issues also that residents were telling the government that were important to them. But there's the risk that they drop down your list of things to do because all these other things are more high profile at the moment. Following that up, in November 2021, the regulator of social housing published its principles about how it is going to change its approach to consumer regulation. And some of the things that will impact on the council, there will be much more in terms of data returns. The council is going to have to provide much more information about how it is performing in delivering its housing services to the housing regulator, and the regulator will use that potentially, well, the complete desktop reviews, and potentially, depending on what that shows to them, they may want to come in to landlords and complete inspections. Now, those of us who have been around long enough will remember inspections in the housing sector, and you may have seen inspections in things like teaching as well. You need to be very well prepared for inspections. So the whole industry around being ready for inspections, being able to prove what you do, have the evidence to show how you do things, and also to show how you've engaged with residents in doing all of that. So a different way of working that the council needs to be prepared for and is starting the work towards, but there's probably some way to go. There are existing consumer regulatory standards that apply currently, but they are being updated. We are still waiting for the detail on the new consumer standards, but the regulator has said these will be the 6 new consumer standards. One around safety, reflecting the issues we've already discussed. One around quality, so you can, that will cover the quality of the home, but also things like damp and mold will fall into there. You can see there'll be a real focus on that, but also a new focus around communal areas. And I think something that's tends to be forgotten in the past, but of great emphasis on communal spaces. And clearly the council has a number of blocks with communal spaces. So that's an area to look at. Another one, re-emphasising the landlord's role in developing communities and healthy neighbourhoods, etc. And also within that, tackling antisocial behaviour within neighbourhoods. A new standard really around transparency. So the landlords will be expected to publish much more information for residents around the way services are provided and how well the landlord is performing. Probably again a re-emphasis around engagement and accountability, but this will be actually probably will become one of the most fundamental parts of the approach, because actually if you're listening to residents, you're working with residents to find solutions, etc., then actually all these other issues should almost solve themselves because you will be doing what's important to residents. And finally, the tenancy standard, again, that's really, you should be a good landlord. You should do what you say in terms of managing tenancies, etc., and the way you let your properties. So that's the consumer standards that the council is going to need to meet. Another big change is going to be the introduction of 22 tenant satisfaction measures, as they're described by the regulator. And again, this is giving with the aim of giving much more focus to what is important to residents. So the top 12 are all satisfaction measures that will be collected as a result of an annual survey. So larger landlords like the council will need to complete an annual survey of residents to ask their satisfaction, and it's quite wide ranging. There's overall satisfaction with repairs, whether your home is well maintained, whether your home is safe, but also things like satisfaction with the communal areas, satisfaction with the way that the council deals with antisocial behaviour, etc. So it's quite wide ranging, and I think this will be quite challenging for a lot of landlords who may not have completed such a satisfaction survey for quite some time. There was again in the news recently, a council in the north that has just completed its first survey for some time that found overall satisfaction was only at 42%. I think that's probably a lot of landlords are going to see satisfaction levels at a similar level. And then there's another 10 standards that the council is going to have to report on, including the way, how well it completes all those building safety checks, but also things like the number of complaints received and the number of antisocial behaviour cases. All of this will need to be collected, provided to the regulator, but also to be published. All this information should be made available to residents. So again, a lot more information that will be available. And just to cover off, the Housing Ombudsman is also becoming much more active in this area. So again, you probably will have read some stories around councils having action by the Housing Ombudsman again for not dealing with complaints well, etc. So it's coming from both sides. You've got the regulator of social housing and the Housing Ombudsman, and they are increasingly coordinating their approach. So if the Ombudsman spots a failing area, then you can expect the regulator will be taking an interest in that as well. So a summary from me, in terms of maybe some of the issues you might want to be concentrating on over the next couple of years as all of this happens. ARC has supported some of the work within the housing service, but we haven't been involved in all of it. So this is a bit of an overview. Clearly, there is that focus on satisfaction levels, and you will need to be able to complete that survey and really think about what the results show to you in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of your housing service. Clearly, you have some issues around repairs, which at the moment, which will probably drive some of that satisfaction for the council. But you do really need to show that you are listening to residents and involving residents in finding the solutions to some of those issues. Then there's issues around the quality of home. So clearly you now have a plan for tackling damp and mould. The quality of the home is the greatest driver of resident satisfaction. So then maintain that investment in the stock and how you identify the priorities. So having a clear asset management strategy. So you show how you prioritise your investment. We've talked about building safety, maintaining that focus on building safety. As Darren has explained, there's been a big investment, a big change in that within the council for the housing stock, but that really needs to be embedded. That new team really needs to settle in and really drive that for the future. But certainly the foundations are in there now. But also you can drive some efficiency. Some of what you've done now has been just by getting people to work harder and throw resources at it. You do need to find more efficient ways of delivering some of that, and I know that's within the plan currently. All that that focus on transparency, again, the council will need to be able to publish much more information to residents, and residents will hopefully start demanding that more as well. There's a national campaign to encourage residents to complain and contact their landlords for information. So you can expect there'll be that focus on transparency will continue. As I've said, a real focus on resident engagement. The council previously had a really good approach to it, or a fairly good approach to resident engagement. Unfortunately, a lot of that dropped away during COVID for understandable reasons, but it is just getting going again. But we're making that work both at the strategic level to set priorities for the council, but also that effective engagement locally. So you're talking to residents within their own estates, within their own blocks, to understand what matters to them and working with them to find the solutions. Again, that is going to be the real focus of the new approach to regulation. Talked about the focus on neighbourhoods, thinking about how you do your housing management and how your housing management develops communities. I think your approach to antisocial behaviour is fairly effective at the moment with the community safety team, but also just building that community resilience. communities can help themselves a lot of the time, and how that can happen. That's part of the wider work of the council as well. In terms of best use of the stock, there is the expectation that councils will make best use of the stock, both in tackling the levels of voids that you have at the moment, which I know is a real focus, but also thinking how the existing stock can best target the local needs. So that is understanding both your existing residents and the needs of those that might be approaching you in the future, and potentially thinking about how you change your services and the way you use your stock to better make best use of meeting people's needs. And I know that's on the agenda at the moment. And finally, and this is going to be an issue for lots of landlords currently, is just being able to prove what you do. At the moment, there is an awful lot of emphasis on improvement, but at times for the regulators, etc., it will be having that proof in place. And like we've talked about with building safety and the golden thread, etc., it is getting used to building up that evidence to show what you do as well.
Thank you very much. Right, over to anybody. Councillor Wesson has a question.
Thanks very much for that presentation, Nick. So I have a couple of questions for you, and then probably also a couple for you as well, Darren. So in terms of the consumer standards, do we have a timescale for the kind of underpinning detail for the consumer standards? Because obviously that's quite critical in terms of the criteria that we're actually being judged against. And then I just wondered on the point that you raised around larger landlords being required to carry out tenant satisfaction surveys. Is there a particular size that the landlords have to be? You know, is it, there are a number of units that they have to have in order to be required to complete those satisfaction surveys? And then Darren, I'm interested to know, what do we do, if anything, in terms of gauging tenant satisfaction at the moment? And then with the increased focus of the regulator and the Ombudsman on complaints, I'm just interested to know if we feel our resource that we allocate to complaints is sufficient.
Okay, if I start with the timescales, really we're expecting that detail to be published at any time now. So all the technical detail guidance around the tenant satisfaction measures, which have to be collected from now, was only published in March, so they are leaving it late, but we are expecting the detail about new consumer standards anytime now. So yeah, that'll be a lot to absorb. In terms of landlords who have to complete the annual survey, it does depend on your size, but so smaller landlords still have to do it, but it doesn't necessarily need to be an annual survey. But if you have a stock of over 10,000, then it has to be an annual survey. So that would apply to Ealing. And then the last survey, the last large survey that was completed was back in 2014 by the council. So that was some time ago. There have been some more targeted surveys, some repairs surveys and that sort of thing in the meantime. But the last census survey type thing was back in 2014. But the council is just going out to procurement to be able to run the next survey with the aim that it should be in November this year.
And remember that also the council put a little bit of a pause on it during the pandemic, but also does its community survey. And that includes more general questions to tenants and leaseholders about how they feel about living on their estates, and how well they think the council's doing, and how well they're listening to to their views. So there is some work done. This is called what used to be called a STAR survey, which is basically a tenants and residents survey. And it asks all these questions that are in Nick's slide around the tenant satisfaction measures. It asks all those questions. So we have historic data. Ealing's actually not unusual that it hasn't been doing the STAR survey because the requirement for it stopped. I always sound like I'm a bit old-fashioned, because I probably am. But quite a lot of the practice in housing that used to happen 10 years ago and 20 years ago was actually pretty good practice, and we just need to modernize it. So we do have good information around satisfaction with things like repairs, that's part of our work, and indeed satisfaction with things like complaints, as you mentioned, Councillor Weston. So we do monitor complaints closely. We were not performing as well as we should have been doing. However, we've addressed that with a new team that led by a very charismatic leader, Carrie, who I hope members have sent their casework through to. And she knows that when she's asking, well, my staff know that when Carrie asks you something, it's actually me asking them, so they tend to jump to, but actually it's also you as well. So, and we do okay on complaints now. We weren't for a while. And indeed, you know, Nick is quite right. The Ombudsman is frankly more stroppy than they used to be. And is not going to take poor practice lightly. We don't get as many judgments as other councils. We're sort of middle of the pack, but we still do occasionally get judgments by the regulator, by the ombudsman, the complaints ombudsman, saying, "Well, hold on a minute, you didn't do that quite right." Particularly with some of the historic cases, and particularly where there's a leasehold property within a council block, because we continually get the confusion in the teams about what is the leaseholder's responsibility and what is the council's responsibility, and it is difficult to decide, because, you know, if it's damp and mold, for example, it might be condensation mold growth. That would be the owner's, the leaseholder's responsibility. Whereas if it's coming through the walls, then of course it's our responsibility. So it's a little bit more tricky, but we just need to get a bit better at that, and we do some good learning from that. And Councillor Weston, there was one more question, I completely missed it, the one in the middle.
No, I think it was fine, actually. It was about satisfaction, and it's been covered. So
right,
thanks very much.
Councillor Mohammed.
Thank you, Chair. Based on what's coming and the changes and the surveys upcoming, do you have any indication areas that you feel that you need to improve on before the survey starts? Thank you.
Okay, so where do I start? So councillors, Cabinet in January agreed to change our repairs contractor. We currently have a repairs contractor called MCP, who are being, how can I put it very politely, demobilised, because they simply haven't been good enough. And we are just mobilising another contractor called Waits. The focus on repairs is important, as Nick said. Often the standard of life within your home, and frankly, whether or not the lift works in your tower block, really does drive how satisfied you are with your landlord. You can understand it yourself. It's about living, and frankly, if you're on the 11th floor and the lift doesn't work, that's an issue for you. You know, you can have the nicest flat in the world, but if you can't get to it with your pushchair or whatever else, that's going to really affect you. So therefore, we need a very responsive, very good, high quality, cost effective repair service. I think what the council did before, because there was multiple contracts all over the place, is that they were looking for possibly the lowest cost option, and that's not the right thing to do in housing. It's all about providing value for money. So we have a good service, but we pay the right amount. That's what we're going to be doing with Waits, and I'm very, very, I'm not hopeful, I'm expectant that the quality of the service on repairs will go up. And that is going to drive a lot of the satisfaction measures, a lot of the satisfaction that tenants have with their homes. We do well in lots of other areas. So Nick mentioned antisocial behaviour. We have a very, very good community safety team. I can't say there is no antisocial behaviour on estates, but there isn't people running riot and setting fire to things as they are in certain areas of London. Actually, the standards of repair, the standards of the actual homes themselves aren't too bad. We've been talking about the ones which we're doing through Broadway Living, and also our estate renewal programme. The council's been really very, very bold in saying these estates just simply don't work. So the Golf Links estate, for example, was pretty notorious back in the day. Copley Close, similarly. Copley Close is further on down the line, but it is a really, really, really good example of first-class estate renewal on an area basis and really changing the nature of that area. And Golf Links will be the same. At the moment, we're working through the stages, but Golf Links are the same, then High Lane. So the council is prepared to take the difficult decisions when it needs to about the standard of the home, the standard of repair. And then we've been catching up in the last year on the repairs and the kitchens and bathrooms and the new windows and the externals and stuff like that we needed to, which we hadn't been able to do during COVID. And we spent about 48 million quid this year, which is a lot on a stock this size, in order to be able to catch up with some of those repairs. So those areas I think we'll be all right on. But frankly, you know, like if your lift doesn't work and the council doesn't come out and repair the leak under your sink or whatever it is, and it's, you know, makes your house smell moldy, that is going to annoy you, and that's the area which I'm focusing on the most to get sorted.
A couple of questions of my own. One, you're talking about Copley Close, and you and Nick were mentioning loneliness. And I know we had a health scrutiny panel a couple of years ago, which actually looked at loneliness as it's actually a sort of factor in mental health, and, you know, affects people's physical health even. And when we went on the site visit to Copley Close, it was mentioned that the estate, although it has sort of improved significantly, it doesn't have the ASB it used to have. It's sort of lost a lot of community spirit. And I just wondered if you had come across any sort of good practice anywhere where that, I mean, in Copley Close, they have got a brand new community centre, which, as we visited, it hadn't been opened yet, but it may be opened by now, or I think it was very soon to open, but which will hopefully help a lot of those issues. But are there any sort of good practices you know about which address sort of community spirit and also addressing loneliness? You know, obviously during the lockdown it was sort of particularly bad, but, you know, people nowadays often sort of go home to their flats and don't know any neighbours. There's not much sharing of cups of sugar or whatever, or even, you know, a cup of tea. So I just wondered, either of you knew anything? So I think, you know, during COVID, it did have an impact, and particularly at places like Copley. Remember, it's not finished yet, and there has been some significant improvements in the public realm. And like you say, there are some community spaces that are becoming activated now. This is a major piece of work that, right the way through, from the leader and cabinet through the whole of SLT, it's one of the conversations that we have the most, which is around the benefit, particularly to people's mental health, but also just their whole feeling of well-being of living in a place, about finding opportunities for people to come together. And I think housing is one thing, and our housing estates is one thing, but I think this is an issue right the way across society, and indeed right the way across Ealing, you know. And I think the council needs to use every opportunity it has to bring people together and to provide spaces so that people can enjoy themselves and not feel that they're not allowed to. And I think in modern society, there's quite a lot of rules telling you what you can't do, but actually we've lost some of that kind of like informality of, like you say, cups of sugar and playing hopscotch in the street and all that kind of stuff. And we have, I don't want to sound all misty-eyed about it, but that stuff was important, because that's a community and that's people looking after each other. And I think we saw a lot of people looking after each other in the pandemic. Don't get me wrong, but I think that kind of like informality stuff, sometimes the council just needs to get out the way and give people permission to do something. I've got a member of staff working for me, Eugene, who's actually in transport, but he's trying to develop what's called a fun strategy, which is all about activating space. And it's all about not big stuff, but it's about, you know, just allowing people to do something, finding a reason why people would stop in an area. People often, you know, I don't know about you, I've got kids. With kids, they often break down social barriers far better than adults do, and we should learn from our children. And if you can find something that will stop a kid at Copley Close and they'll start playing, then other kids will join, then all of a sudden, guess what, the mums and the dads are talking to each other, and then you've got the start of a relationship and all that sort of stuff. And we need to take those every single opportunity we have. It's a big challenge for modern society, and I think it's a big challenge for Ealing, but I know it's something which, particularly with the work around our 7 towns and all the work around that Amanda's doing, my colleague, around sort of activating communities, it's something that's really important.
In housing, it's particularly important because we have a unique relationship with our tenants and leaseholders, particularly our tenants. These are some of the most vulnerable people in our communities. That's the reason why they got that social housing in the first place. So we need to do more for those people, and to find ways in which they can really feel empowered to be part of that community. And that's why we're providing money in job skills and enterprise and encouraging them. Our work around damp and mold is all about using our financial inclusion advisors to support people to ensure they're getting the right benefit entitlement, but also encouraging them to get out of their home and kind of, you know, breathe the fresh air outside, because one of the major causes of damp and mold is just the amount of time people are spending in their homes at the moment. People are there 24 hours a day, and you know, when you're sitting in your house breathing out, you are the person that's creating the moisture. If we can get people used to go out to work and come back again, if you know there's a problem with worklessness, or people have got any form of physical or emotional reason why they can't work, the financial inclusion advisors are asking them whether they want support, and then signposting the support across the council, because we need to do more for our tenants than others. So it's a really, really important area. I can't say I've got all the answers, and I can't say anywhere else has got all the answers either, but it's certainly something which we're working very hard and very closely on at the moment.
I'm going to break one of my rules that I said earlier. You know, I want only questions on the presentation, but there was one little thing that I saw mentioned the other day, which I wonder if Nick may come back on. The government apparently, sort of the Prime Minister sort of rode back. He was planning to abolish the system of leaseholds, and apparently after a sort of the to and fro with Michael Gove, he's now rode back on that. But apparently Michael Gove is going to announce next month a range of measures to protect 10 million leaseholders. But I just wondered, I mean, I didn't even know they were planning to abolish leasehold, but obviously we often, there are issues with leaseholders, you know, improving properties. They you know, often resent the bill that they're given, the fees, to, you know, what's it called, the service charges. Apparently, yeah, there's going to be a cap on ground rents is going to be introduced. Yeah, I just wondered, and also when it comes to regenerating whole estates, you know, it's often a, you know, I know in my ward, you know, certain parts of certain blocks where we thought we'd like to regenerate that, but we know there's so many leaseholders in it that the cost of buying them out would just make it, unviable. Yeah, I just wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
So this has been a debate that has been around for a long time, and there's been various reports that it was expected the government might pick up on, but leasehold isn't going to disappear. Clearly, there's so many leaseholders in existence that there is going to continue. There will be some extra protections, and again, for leaseholders, and again, more transparency of information for leaseholders is probably what you can expect as part of that. It was potentially looking to push other types of tenure, because in effect, as a leaseholder, what you do is you're still a tenant, but you buy a very long tenancy. But it was looking to change that to maybe things like common hold, where the residents jointly own, or the freeholders in effect. So and therefore have more power within that relationship, and would just appoint managing agents. It looks like they're rolling back on that, but we'll still need to wait and see the detail.
Anybody else has any more questions? I can't see any virtually. So we'll move on to the next item. Thank you very much. Item 9, which is again Darren, this time on housing options and homelessness.
Well, I think, Chair, I think probably what I picked up from when I was talking to you and other councillors around your quite long and extensive investigation into genuinely affordable homes, but not just the building of genuinely affordable homes, but making them real homes and real communities. It's exactly the sort of things that came up in the questions that we've been having this evening around So what does that exactly mean? How well is the council prepared? So I thought it might be useful. And I can talk a little bit about, because I know Jack Dempsey came last time to talk about the locata system and how people bid. But I thought it would just be interesting just to point members in the direction of the things that are kind of keeping me awake at night at the moment, and what the council is trying to do about that. So the big, outside of our responsibilities as a landlord for the almost 10,000 homes where we have tenancies, but also 6,500 leasehold properties. The real thing that I'm concerned about at the moment is the effect, and it's a bit of a quadruple whammy really. The effect of government policy on the private rented sector, and particularly about housing benefit, the rising cost of living, and then the Bank of England's decision to try and combat inflation through the raising of interest rates, and then the changes to the taxation system, and how the government reacted to the last financial crisis in 2008 through quantitative easing and very, 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 artificially low interest rates on borrowing, and what that's going to mean for Ealing, both now but also over the next couple of years. Because the situation which we have is that post 2008, the government lowered borrowing rates and actually pumped money into the economy. And one of the main things that ended up in was people's homes and house prices. And particularly in West London, and indeed in Ealing, there's a particularly acute problem where people were buying houses at such inflated values, knowing that the yield they get, the rent they would get when they rented it out, was somewhere between 1.8 and 2.1%. So that's a paper thin yield. So people were buying houses for $750,000 and expecting an incredibly small rent in return for it, in proportion to the value of the house. It was still a difficult rent. And what that's meant is in the borough is that the private rented sector has got bigger and bigger and bigger. It's almost half the houses in the borough now are privately rented. And the reason why that is appropriate is because the government have then fixed that affordability gap so people can remain in the borough through housing benefit or universal credit and housing benefit. Because if you look at the average wage in the borough, the average wage, household wages in the borough is around about 38,000. For a one-bedroom studio flat, you would need to be earning £80,000 a year plus that includes a 25% deposit for the house that you're buying to buy the average one-bedroom flat in the borough. So the ability of people to be able to come up with that deposit, but also to be able to afford the mortgage payments, even with previously low interest rates, is completely prohibitive. So what people have done in order to be able to stay in the borough is they have been able to rent. And the affordability gap has been in the past plugged through housing benefit. What the government have now said is that they've frozen what's called local housing allowance, which is the maximum amount you can get in housing benefits. So what we're finding is that an increasing number of people are coming to our front door for homelessness support because their landlord has said, listen, I can't do this. I want to put the rent up. And they are not, because housing benefits has been frozen and rents have increased. The amount they're having to find to top it up has become unaffordable. In some instances, it's twice the local housing allowance. So a local housing allowance, you get around about £1,800 a month. Sometimes we're having people that are in four bedroom houses, sometimes 5-bedroom houses at £3,000 a month. So therefore, they can't afford the difference between the two. So they turn up in our front door saying, hold on a minute, I need some help. And the reason why those rents are going up is because, first of all, interest rates have gone up. And if you're running on a yield of 1.8 to 2.1% and interest rates are now closer to 4%, that means you can earn more money as a landlord putting your money in your post office savings account than you can owning and renting out a house in Ealing. So therefore, lots of private landlords, including large institutional private landlords, are selling up and selling up in droves. We've got one very large landlord who wants 180 properties that we've been using for temporary accommodation back, and they are taking us to court because we're saying, no, you can't have it back because we've got a long-term relationship with them, which they're trying to get out of. And they are probably prepared to pay the fines they're going to get from taking us to court because they're losing so much money on it. The government's also changed the taxation system, so therefore private sector landlords are not able to write off their interest payments against their income that they get on a personal basis, and again that's motivated people to do. So we've got this perfect storm of rents going up, making it so that tenants in the private rented sector that may have never been anywhere near the council in their life now can't afford those homes. Them turning up at our front door, and because private sector landlords are saying, well, hold on a minute, I don't want to be a private sector landlord anymore, the supply of temporary homes for us to be able to put people into is also going down, which is then driving up rents even further because we're bidding with people. The other thing that puts petrol on the flames is the behaviour of the Home Office. So the Home Office seems completely incapable of running an asylum system, and what they're doing is they are housing, I say that in the loosest sense of the word, large numbers of people who are stuck in the asylum system because their assessments haven't been made. And there's a company called ClearSpring going around buying up pretty much every hotel bedroom in London and buying up lots and lots of other settings in London that we would otherwise use for our people that we need to house temporarily, because they're using them for those people who are in that system. And that is adding additional pressures to it. So that is the thing which we are most concerned about, is this benefit, this conundrum we have between increasing amount of demand for homelessness support and a reducing amount of supply of temporary accommodation places that we can put people into. That's why we're doing, 2008 was a similar problem, and we did long-term deals with landlords, and that's how we secure stock. Now, frankly, we're struggling, to be honest with you, Chair, and we're kind of running out of ideas, and having to look further and further and further away from the borough to be able to source particularly the larger homes, because there are not very many 3, 4 and 5 bedroom houses in Ealing, and the ones that are worth a pretty penny, and they are uneconomic for us to be able to put people into. So that's the area which is, and I don't particularly want to open up new areas, but you did ask me where the areas which are keeping me awake at night, and that's the main thing I'm finding particularly difficult. I think it's going to be a real challenge for the council over the next few years.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not going to make a party political point about how it's all blamed Right to Buy has caused all this, but it is.
We do have a scheme where we're buying back previous Right to Buy properties.
Yeah, exactly. But that's where we're going to end up, and we're going to end up paying a fortune for properties which used to be ours in the first place. Okay, anyone got any questions on this particular point? So, Mohammed.
Thank you, Chair. Just a suggestion. I hear the difficulties, and I think it's a very complex and difficult situation. Nobody has the answer, but most of all is the residents that are suffering the most, but nobody has the solution for it. But you mentioned about kind of purchasing back council or stock right to buy scheme. Has it been considered perhaps buying private properties within the borough? Is there a scheme of a similar that could be rolled out, same principle? Thank you.
Yes, so we have, we've been doing it for a few years now. It's relatively small numbers, but we do have a scheme where we go out and we buy street properties, particularly the ones that we find it most difficult, and we're buying it off the open market to then use as temporary accommodation. So yeah, we do have that. We're not only just buying in the borough, we're buying in Hounslow, and we're buying in Slough, and we're buying outside the borough, because we need to be able to get houses at a particular price. So therefore the support we get from the government is able to then match the payments that we need to make on that house. But yes, we do that, and we're doing it quite successfully. And indeed, Councillor Manroe as the lead member for this area, is particularly keen to do more of this. We've just bought a building called Aspect House, which is in North Acton. It's actually within the Old Oak Common housing development area. And we bought that this year, and that's going to be used for temporary accommodation too. And I think it's 39 units within that, 39 homes within there. So we are out there and we are trying our best to do it, but it is a little bit like swimming up a waterfall at the moment because there is so much more demand than there was previously.
Feel free to come back.
Just another suggestion, just to follow up. We are doing a lot of regeneration in Ealing, and I come across a lot of empty properties that is waiting to be demolished, etc. I do understand some of those properties are beyond livable, not fit for habitation. But has it ever been considered while they're waiting? Because sometimes the planning and everything else can take years, and they sit there empty while you have got 12,000 plus on a waiting list. Has it been any consideration on that?
Yes. So those ones, once they've been so what you're talking about, councillor, is that when you have an area of estate renewal, when we decant tenants and leaseholders from it, we have a property that then sits empty. Yes, we are using those. It's actually a challenge for us to do more of that. We are currently at about 320 homes like that we're using, because as you say, you know, some tenants, and particularly leaseholders, they know that this is coming, and frankly they want to sell up as quickly as possible. Others hang on right until the very last minute. We have a broad spectrum of approaches, and what we do with the ones which come in early, as long as they're in a fit state, you know, there's a limit we can spend on it because they're not going to be there forever, that we do them up and we use them for temporary accommodation. And we've got quite a lot on the Havelock estate because that's been slightly stalled, but also up at High Lane, I think I've got about 28, 30 up there, and we spend around about 20,000 doing them up, and we know we can get that back again through the rent that we then charge through temporary accommodation over about 5 or 6 years. If we're going to knock them down before that, you know, sometimes it's quite difficult because they're only like got an extra year in it, and it's not worth the money of spending doing the place up. Because often when things are decanted, they are, when the tenant leaves, they do tend to take everything, including sometimes the pipe work. So there is a need to invest in them. But yes, it is exactly the right thing to do, and we do it. We probably could end up doing more rather than less of it because it's so important.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time, but Councillor Hashani, you have a question, I believe.
Hi. Hi, no, I don't have a question. I'm sorry.
Sorry, no, it's my eyesight. It's Councillor Stafford.
Thank you very much, Chair, and just welcome back to Darren, to Ealing. I think there's sort of, what's the word, boomerang kids who come back. We must have boomerang officers that are coming back, but you're very welcome back. I won't also rise to debate about the Home Office. I'm sure we all want to see illegal immigration and asylum seekers who are illegal immigrants removed as quickly as possible if they are refused. But going to the point about the problem with the private rented sector, which I completely agree with, one of the biggest concerns I had about the licensing scheme, and which seems to be borne out by good private sector landlords in my own ward, are that the licensing scheme is the straw that's broken the camel's back for them. I'm not saying it's the driving force for them to sell up and move on from being private rented landlords, but a number of them, significant number of them, have emailed me to say that not just the fee, but indeed the process of applying for it has been it's just another burden on them. So I wondered what you were doing to make an assessment of the effect of that scheme on people pulling themselves out of being from the private landlord scheme, and how you'll respond if, as I feel it will be, it's a disincentive for people to continue being landlords.
Okay, so the properties I'm talking about in terms of supply are the ones that we procured for temporary accommodation, and those properties were subject to all of the safety checks and indeed fees prior to the introduction of the selective licensing scheme for landlords. So those are I think there's two separate things here. There's the landlords who are in the borough renting out through an estate agent or through other means to people who find them independently, but then also the properties that we use for temporary accommodation. I was particularly referring to the ones that we use for temporary accommodation, and the driving force behind them leaving the sector. The feedback we have from them is very much that their profit margin has gone, and indeed it's a deficit to them. Many of them were anticipating increases in capital value, and that's not necessarily happening either. So that is why they're requiring it to come back. But they were regulated before and indeed had to pay fees in order to be able to be inspected already. So I don't think for that the selective licensing scheme has particularly been the reason why. I don't know the stuff around the other motivation within the private rented sector. What I can say is that we are due to come back to Cabinet in around about January, I think it is, because the scheme's been in since the 1st of January as the broader borough-wide scheme, or not quite borough-wide scheme, but the broader scheme. And we're due to come back and do a 12-month review of the effectiveness of it. What I would say is that even in the early stages of it, we are discovering some very, very good landlords, but we're also finding some situations where tenants are not living in good conditions, and they're not living in homes which the landlord has provided effective gas safety checks and all of those sorts of things. So, I think no one's arguing about the fact that the council should make sure that tenants are safe. I think this is about the mechanism of the actual selective licensing scheme and the fees associated with it. But like I say, there is a 12-month review which will be happening in January and coming back to Cabinet, which we'll be able to know more.
Are you good with that? Okay, I actually have a supplementary question on that. Just very briefly, you said that obviously a lot of private landlords are selling up. Who are they selling to? Is it just other private landlords who think they can make a go of it?
Possibly one of our ways out of it, Councillor, is that we could be a purchaser of some of those units, as was suggested at the back. So if you have a medium-sized private sector landlord that wants to sell up, frankly, if they are prepared to sell it at a reasonable price, it could well be an opportunity for the council to buy those properties off them. We can't do it for all of them, of course, but if there's one there. Who are they selling it to? They're selling them on the general market, and they're selling them through auction houses. The auction houses have never been busier because often they're not just losing a little bit of money because of interest rates. When you're looking at a 1.8 to 2% margin, and at the moment, when their current, if it's an individual, their mortgage product finishes and they need to remortgage, or indeed if they're an institutional investor, when their bond scheme finishes and they need to refinance, they are on quite expensive properties here. They are paying 2%, 3% more than they were before, and more than they're getting back in rent. So they have two choices. They either go to the tenant and say, I want much more rent, which some are doing, but then the tenants are coming back to us because they can't afford it, or what they're doing is they're selling up. They might be selling to each other, or they might be selling on the private open market. But that's where we think it is. What we're hoping as well, Councillor, is some of the ones that are trying to sell on the open market leave it out there for 6 to 8 months and realise they're not going to sell it, and then come back to us cap in hand asking us to re-rent it off them. But maybe that's hopeful rather than a definite strategy.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very conscious of the time, so I'm gonna move on to the rest of the meeting. Item 10 is the draft final report. Haji, have you got anything? Yeah, I'm going to move on to recommendations. So I'm not going to read out the feedback from the Copley Close visit. But yes, we agree the final report, presumably. Councillor Booth.
Just a point I think Harjeet might have explained to you before the meeting is that the recommendations is 10, that recommendation 6 and 7 are both the same. So we've actually only got 9 recommendations.
Yeah, I think that's a clerical error. It'll be amended. Thank you. Right, we just go through the recommendations. I think there's maybe a couple more tonight to discuss. But yeah, has anybody got any comments on other than that point about the duplicate, about any of these existing recommendations? Yeah, I was just wondering whether we could have there is a scrutiny panel in the next calendar year, in the next council year, which is including housing. If some of the matters, for example, the building regulator and building safety, if we could recommend to that panel that they sort of ask for feedback on how that's going, maybe at the end of the year or early next year. Especially if it's coming in October. Yes. If that panel can be updated, so we can sort of carry this work through. And another, we can discuss the wording of some of these, but on the subject of the sort of shortage of skilled fire safety and building control people, maybe a recommendation that the council continues to encourage apprenticeships in those departments to make sure that the council has sufficient skilled personnel to tackle all these challenges in the coming years. What Councillor Cordier was mentioning about beds and sheds, do you think there could be a recommendation on that? I don't know how to word it, but
I think the planning department should look into it to really act under the legislation. I don't know what the verdict should be, to enforce these illegal beds and sheds.
I know it's particularly bad in Southall, but it is sort of a borough-wide problem as well.
Borough-wide, yes, yeah, that's right.
And something along the lines of we should be conscious of our existing housing stock, even to, we're talking about high-rise buildings, but some of these are very, very small buildings, but they're probably where people are living in the worst conditions.
Yes, yeah.
Sorry, Councillor Mohammed.
I think I haven't finished yet. Yeah, I think in Western Road, Southall, I think it was the people were living in a congested, I think, environment. One of the gas leaked, and it was a very dangerous blast. And the girl, the woman, young girl, is still in hospital, I think. Yeah, so I think because of the, I don't know what the condition of the building was. So I think enforcement should be really working.
Thank you, Chair. This is just a suggestion. perhaps consider a register where those kind of illegal construction can be registered, so any potential residents or renters know about it's available to them. So, for example, what you're doing on fire safety aspect on publishing on the Ealing website, perhaps something that there is a register there, so landlords are aware of that they've been perhaps name and shamed on top of the enforcement route. Thank you.
Well, you mean a list of properties which are, there is a property there, but it's not illegal. So, beware of renting it or whatever. Darren, yeah.
I think maybe, Councillor Chair, so I think possibly what you could do is use the information that coming out of the selective licensing scheme and ensure that's published, so that if you are a prospective private renter, you can look it up to see whether or not this is a properly licensed property or not. But I also think there should be then, as you were saying, Councillor Corris, that there is, I think possibly a future panel could look at the amount of resourcing within the planning enforcement team to make sure that there is enough, because it's an important issue, that it is properly resourced, and just have a look at the outcomes that are achieving. But I think, if you can say to private renters or potential private renters, this is licensed, so we know it's safe, and this isn't licensed, so we don't know if it's safe or not. When you then go, you can make your choice about it. I think, unfortunately, many of these people are very vulnerable, so frankly, they'll take anywhere they get. However, I think you can, it is at least good information for people. But I think it is then, as you're saying, it is about the resource in order to be able to find them, but also to find the property, but also then to be able to take the effective action to deal with it. And there is, I'm not just saying it because I run the team, but it is a very good team, but there's a lot of it. It's a bit like whack-a-mole, you sort it out there and it just pops up over there. And some of them are quite nice units, some of them are awful. As you were saying, there has been some instances. So I think it could be something that you could recommend that a future panel looks at in terms of that stuff around building safety and looking at the safety of people within unauthorised developments as well.
Okay, well, let us try to hammer out a recommendation after the meeting. But yeah, we think there should be a recommendation on beds and sheds and general poor quality existing and illegal housing. I don't think we particularly need a recommendation, but I welcome the point you're making about transparency, and that it sounds like the regulation, the legislation itself encourages a much greater transparency, and that tenants, have a right to see building. So what did you call them? Building safety cases. Yeah. Maybe we could have a recommendation that a future panel, the next year's panel, could check in next spring to make sure you've followed through and tenants can access those building safety cases in our own buildings. I'm not sure actually might have been. Yeah, sorry. And the last recommendation, again, I think there was a consensus in the room, that if these private landlords are selling up, and if there are, empty homes and other properties that we could sort of snaffle up and accommodate people, that we would like to see that. So maybe we recommend the Cabinet sort of make funds available to buy private homes or privately owned homes when practical, to house people. So you're saying they're all for temporary, rather than you wouldn't put a sort of give somebody an actual tenancy.
It depends really how much we can get them for, to be honest with you, because we've got to be able to. So for affordable homes, we would need to be able to buy them with support through grant in order to be able to get them. So if we can get grant from the GLA through the affordable housing programme, and indeed if it qualifies for us to use our right to buy receipt, yes, of course we can rent them out at socially rented levels. But the ones that were by the spot purchases on the street are used for temporary accommodation, because our main objective is to get people out of B&B, because that's, particularly for families, it's a really awful outcome for them. So it's better to get them out of B&B and get them into a proper home, even if it's a temporary home, whilst we go through that support, and eventually, they go through then the allocations policy, and based on need, they then get those homes. They do have a big priority if they're in temporary accommodation, so they're still seen as homeless. So yeah, but it all depends. Frankly, if we're buying a lot of them, it's much easier to talk to the GLA about getting grant. If we're just buying one house, the GLA is not really interested about it, because it's not a scheme as such. But yeah, it's something we can, so it's both of them.
It may be a separate, may not be able to go into the same recommendation, but I think there was also a call for us to expand our use of decanted properties, to use them up until the last possible minute, to put people in them, rather than having them homeless or in B&Bs. Yeah. So I think that might be a recommendation. Yeah, Councillor Mohammed.
This is a recommendation, but not sure if it is the right platform. I don't see anything to do with bidding and suitability in any of the recommendation. Is there a room for that? Don't know how to word it, but there should be something as a recommendation to tackle that, because it's a big part of how houses and properties are allocated on residents on a waiting list. And also, sorry, just the last question, recommendation 4, and this is for Darren, it says regular checks under the Decent Home Standard. Is there a best practice frequency that perhaps that we can add to that, rather than leaving it as a loose regular? Because a regular could be 10 years or 5 years.
Yeah, so the standard, so we should be looking at them once every 5 years. So we do 20% of the stock every year. It costs a lot of money to go and survey things, but we go in and we assess 20% of the stock. So once every 5 years, something will be, every house in the borough gets looked at once every 5 years. In terms of the allocations policy, remember the Overview and Scrutiny Committee considered the allocations policy in quite some detail, and indeed it then went to Cabinet and was adopted. Was it February? Anyway, January, February time as well. So it is quite a big piece of work we've done quite recently. So please don't ask me to do it again, because it's a hell of a piece of work.
Councillor Mohammed, I can't. Were you here the last meeting when we had a Q&A about locator? Yeah, because we went into quite some detail, and I'm not sure what. I guess there would have been a recommendations then if we could have thought of any, but maybe if you could email me sort of what the particular issues are that you're finding, and we will see if it could be a recommendation. But we were, everybody listened to how locator works, and the people running it. There are no tricks. It's not. There's not sort of a way of playing the game. It is, literally first come, first served, and those who are, in the most need get to the top of the list. But if you don't bid, you don't get it. So maybe there may be elements for people, why are they not bidding? But again, I think your department sort of tries to find out why people aren't bidding.
Particularly if they're an expensive temporary accommodation, Chair, we don't just encourage them, we make them bid. Because they have got primary need, they're in greatest need, and they should be getting those properties. And if they stop bidding, we will contact them and ask them why.
Okay, I think that probably wraps up the recommendations we need to make. Nobody online is raising any hands, so I'll take that as a consensus. And if I'm not mistaken, that's brought us to the end of the meeting and the end of our year. Thank you very much, everybody, for all their contributions and for all those speakers, and Darren for you getting all the right council officers and presentations, and thanks to Harjeet for all her hard work behind the scenes. Yeah, thanks very much, and good luck to the next scrutiny panels for carrying on this very important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
You can all go home if you're not already home.
Chair, sorry, it's Councillor Stafford. I didn't want to prolong this, but as the Vice Chair of the panel, I think it falls to me to thank you for your work over the year, marshalling us, making sure that the agendas are appropriate and interesting. And I very much enjoyed working with you over this last year. I'm sure other councillors have. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, and thanks once again for stepping in when I was abroad in July. So thank you very much. Okay, good night.